Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions. This is the beginning of a new week, so let's start exploring a new theme. This one's going to be a bit bittersweet. We're going to be exploring bands that only ever made one album, and the only ever made is important. We're not going to be looking at bands that just happen to have one album and might be working on a second. These are bands that the first album came out a while ago and either they explicitly broke up or there's just been no word about a follow-up. In that vein, we're going to be starting off this week with Caladan Brood. Looking at the album Echoes of Battle, we're going to be looking at the title track of it, Echoes of Battle. This album came out almost a decade to the date, February 15th, 2013. There has been no follow-up to this album. If you enjoy this, well, you have one album's worth of excellent music to look forward to. Let's dive into this and see what Caladan Brood is bringing to the table today. Oh, went right back to where we were. So now... Nope, we're just going to go between the two chords. Okay. So far it's all very MIDI, which makes sense for 2013. So we just dropped that last line to bring in this guitar part. Okay. Interestingly, this guitar chord, it's the same one that we had on the MIDI choir, but instead of playing it all straight, we're arpeggiating it. Okay, atmospheric sounds of battle. It's a bit chaotic in an overwhelming way, but I think that's intentional. Definitely by design, I'd say. A lot of folk influence on this. We've had the electric guitar so far. I was just going to talk about how we haven't had any strict black metal guitar work, but here we are. The timing of it. I like how we have the quick picking on an acoustic guitar. And back to an adaptation of our intro. Okay. Ooh. Yeah. So they're equal distant. And our lower note or a higher note changes. Yeah, very cool. They're equidistant intervals up until the end, and then there's a flourish. Very emotive too. They're really going for a larger than life element. What is this? This dance beat going on. We've kept that offbeat cymbal work into this. All in response between the clean and the harshes. Halftime. Bringing in our intro. You know, it really is a pretty big shame that on the surface level, black metal is so uh, offensive to my ears. That's not the word I want, but I think it's what's popping in my head. I just don't enjoy the general qualities that black metal tends to employ. But as we've discovered over time, there's a lot of really great composition in black metal and black metal adjacent songs. And something like this really showcases some beautiful composition that is black metal adjacent but doesn't have the sonic qualities of it, other than our vocals, which not unexpectedly is my least favorite part of this track. But it just, we talked about this last week, a week ago, right? 2 weeks ago. I don't remember what it was. It was a while ago. And I had mentioned that, black metal is just one of those genres that tends to attract. Oh, it was for the Casey Crescenzo video. I said black metal just tends to attract a lot of people who want to write Baroque music but don't want to write it with Baroque instrumentation. And there's some really great composition in black metal that I just can't get into because of the presentation. This isn't Baroque based, um, but it is beautiful composition. They just chose not to put it behind a more um, aggressive presentation or production. And for that, I quite enjoy this. It has some moments that are a bit grating on me sonically, but 9 times out of 10, I legitimately enjoyed this track, which is surprising given that it is black metal on a lot of ways. Let's dig into this, and instead of just me saying words, let's figure out why this is black metal. What's great about it, Let's figure out some specifics. So first of all, we begin the track with a very folkish introduction. We have a choir that introduces our opening chordal vamp. We have two chords. The MIDI choir showcases them to us, and for the most part, throughout the whole song, that's going to be our foundation. Yeah, every section I can remember, which was I think most of them. I would go on record to say every section in the track is based off of a two chord vamp, just moving back and forth between the tension and the resolve, the tension and the resolve. We eventually add on to this with some flute, a possibly a lute, but some sort of acoustic guitar, acoustic stringed instrument that's plucked, and then eventually the vocals and distorted electric guitar. Now, this takes up our first 2 minutes or so and builds a lot of the fundamental ideas that we'll continue to see throughout this song, which is chordal ideas in our foundation, some sort of melodic idea that is actually just harmony. It's just chords. Um, we see this in the flute oftentimes. We also see it in the electric guitar the first time it's introduced, where all it's doing is playing the chords, but instead of strumming all the notes at one time, we have a rising and falling pattern across the arpeggiation. Um, and so we'll start with the root tone, we'll play a couple notes or specific notes in our arpeggio, but it's not necessary to understanding this. We play our octave. Oh no, we actually go up to the fifth above the octave, don't we? Anyways, we reach a peak and we come back down on the same exact notes. And so we have this do 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 kind of idea. They kind of bounce around a little bit where they will skip a note and come back down to it. So there's kind of like a stepwise thing going on. But for the most part, they have rising action and falling action as they hit the lowest and highest tone, all within the chord. It isn't specifically a melody. It is just a monophonic way of playing a chord, one note at a time. But it's disguised as melody because they sound pretty and you're only hearing one note at a time and it kind of gets stuck in your head. It's kind of catchy. Um, and so we have our foundation, which is chords. We have our chordal melodies, our arpeggiations. We have some sort of percussion going on, which is usually on the sparser end. Usually something that accents every other beat and has 1 or 0 beats in between to act as syncopation. So in one case, we had a lower tone and a higher tone, sort of like a bass kick and a snare, though I'm not going to say they sounded like that. It's very possible they were using folk drum, which was some sort of stretched material over probably a wooden band. And then you just hit it. Not much different from a drum head on a snare, but a little bit different. And we would get something like boom, boom, ka, boom, boom, ka, boom, 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 ka. Something very sparse that is primarily there to create a little bit of rhythmic syncopation and to accent those beats. That is what a majority of the drum work is here. And that really helps the song from ever feeling like it's a bit too much, from it feeling antagonistic, from it feeling like it wants to run away and just have so much forward momentum and get away from us, like black metal tends to do. Even at slower speeds, black metal utilizes a lot of 16th notes, which feels really fast. In essence, we could probably look at a lot of this as black metal without the 16th notes. When we look at our choir that tends to hold whole notes out of our chords, instead of whole notes, if we did 16 16th notes, that would and we'd have to make it one note at a time. So you give one note to one guitar and then the middle note to another guitar, and now you have black metal. This just condenses it down, puts the octave on top, and allows the note to be held out. But otherwise, like I was saying, this can be felt like really slow black metal where notes actually get held out rather than repeatedly played until we move to the next note. With a little bit of flourish to it. And that's where like the arpeggiation comes in. And so the drumming feeling like it's really slow and sparse is just that slow black metal drumming. What if instead of 16th notes on the bass kick and blast beats on the snare, well, we only accented the important parts, beats 2 and 4, and a couple of individual offbeats here and there on the bass kick to emphasize a groove. And that's it. It's still very much black metal. If you just fill in all the space, you have a black metal drum part. Now, the part where we start to divert from this a little bit is when we reach our ornamental and atmospheric aspects. There are some instruments that come in and don't do foundational or melodic elements. They just kind of fill space a little bit. There is this really warm sound that sits around everything at times. It feels very synthy, but given the MIDI properties of a lot of these instruments, it could just be some sort of MIDI pad. I don't know, a synth pad. It doesn't seem to change notes with the two chords. It just sort of sits out here on the outsides and holds everything. And it's a very warm sound. We picked it up near the end, but it might have been in some of the busier sections and I just didn't notice it. And it adds texture to it. It makes everything feel very warm. And this is pretty much how every section is built. The roles of the instruments can change. The electric guitar, like I mentioned, we get introduced to it as a melodic chord, but eventually we do hear it as the black metal 16th note playing a single note, which gives it that chordal property, but we don't get to hear the full chord. It has to be paired with something else who's playing another note with the same speed, and then we get that dyad, which implies the chord. And we do hear that, but that also places the guitar from a semi-melodic component to the foundational role. We do hear the choir move from holding out just these notes to playing melodies. So it's really interesting how the instruments aren't fixed in their role and they can shift around depending on what the song needs. The flute, for instance, occasionally picks up as an ornamental or atmospheric sound, just kind of fits around everything. It also has a full melody at one point, which is really neat, and it does that arpeggiated chordal idea at the very beginning. So the instruments are not locked in place, they do end up doing several different things. The vocals are firmly rooted in black metal. They have that nasally, compressed, directed, harsh sounds. Um, they're very, the narrowness makes them feel weak, but the crackle gives them some width, and I'm sure there's some EQing that goes along with it as well to kind of flesh it out a bit. But it is rather underwhelming, which I think never really works for black metal, especially higher production black metal, or I should say clearer production black metal, where the music feels big and loud and extravagant, and there's just like so many notes being played, and then you have this guy still like this. It's a terrible. That was terrible. I apologize. But you have like this little nasally goblin sound going on, and to me, that's a mismatch. And that's just, my biases and not having a lot of experience coming into black metal real late into it. I'm sure fans really enjoy that mismatch, and it's something that draws them to it. But I would much prefer a larger, wider harsh to go with the sound. But here it kind of fits. In a lot of these sections, it feels very personal. It almost feels like a small troupe of traveling musicians with somebody telling a story over the music to whatever crowd of 15 people they can find that would pony up the money for this show. In like medieval times, this is a little traveling group of musicians who go city to city, and this is how they make a living, trying to avoid bandits and playing their music for people that tell stories of tales. It's sort of like a bard, but band style, not just a dude in a lute. We have a bunch of people to play with us. And one of them's got an electric guitar. Do you folks know what that is? I don't either. Electricity hasn't been invented yet. Um, but that's kind of the vibe I get. It's very personal. It's very closed off. There's lots of space between the instrumentation. The production feels like it's in an open area. And so the sort of nasally, smaller voice kind of works with sort of the smaller feeling of the track in a lot of the sections. It does have some largeness to it, especially when we get to the more pure black metal section and our bombastic outro. Not outro, the final section we go to before we get to the outro. Those tend to be a bit bigger, and as expected, I think the vocals fit a little less there, but it's really interesting to hear the vocals, and they're still not really my cup of tea, but to at least think they fit with the music better, which is, again, a step up for me from typical black metal work. These vocals, though, were accompanied with this very cool, clean vocal that was always harmonized. It was a very throaty, oh, just really projecting from the back of the mouth, and getting this wide open, warm sound with sort of a lower end pitch to it. And it was that one plus another one. And they always worked in tandem. I don't think we ever heard a single one of them in isolation. What's cool though is that they don't just stop it at the interval that they have, which I don't know what the interval was, but it was consistent. If one person was on the root and the other one was on the fifth, for example, I don't know if that's what it was, they were consistently that far apart no matter what notes they were playing. However, at the end of a phrase, the second time they came around, the lower one, higher one, I don't remember which one it was, at the end of the phrase would drift off and kind of do a little flourish and end on a different note, which changed our interval. So all of our phrases actually end on a different emotion than the rest of them are always on. So it's really fascinating listening to this, and hearing these little micro adjustments there. We eventually did hit a point where they did a call and response between the growls and these choir-esque vocals. It's really interesting. We had live choir, and then we also had MIDI choir underneath it. Good stuff. And I really love that part. Once again, it's just, there's so many little good elements here. Now, aside from all that, which pretty much covers the general idea of most of the song musically, because it is fairly linear. There were a couple callbacks, but for the most part, I don't think I heard much repetition, and they were all incredibly dense, working with 7+ instruments in some of them. That I'm not going to be able to go in depth on every single section, but I think that covers the general idea of how they go about composing their song. What I really think is interesting past that is the emotion of the track and how they utilize chords and melodies to craft specific feelings throughout the song, which that feeling, that atmosphere, the emotional connection does shift over time. We have a song that sort of feels lighthearted at the beginning. We just have a choir and a flute and some light drumming, and it's just very typically folkish to me. It's lighthearted, it's fun, it kind of has kind of like a foresty vibe to it. Oh, there is a full drum kit in here though, isn't there? Not in the beginning, I mean just in this track in general. I forgot about that. Because I mentioned the folk drums at the beginning, but there is a full kit eventually. Because we got to talk about that dance section. Um, and then we bring in the electric guitars a little bit, but they sort of still fit in with that general vibe. We eventually shift over into some more black metal elements, which feel more aggressive just due to having those 16th note attacks. But note wise, chordally, it still kind of continues on with that sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Whimsical? Kind of whimsical thing. Um, Somewhere in here, though, not too long after this, I think, it's sort of setting the stage for the battle, and we end up hearing field recordings or atmospheric sounds of metal on metal clashing. We hear people yelling. It kind of surrounds the song and makes the entire sound sphere feel very compressed, like it's getting filled up. I was quite anxious during this section, and I was happy when we moved out of it and we removed those sounds, because even though we added all those instruments and it was pretty full, it still felt like there was space. But when we put that in there, it sounded like the song was going to burst through the sound sphere, which is definitely what they were going for. Tension and anxiety during a battle feels like it should go hand in hand, and I think they achieved that through the production there. Um, we go through a few different vibes of kind of jumping back and forth between this more antagonistic straight black metal stuff and the folkier chordal progressions. It's two chords, but the folkier chordal progression, until we hit a really interesting part where we dip down into a low. And I was trying to figure out what was going on here, and out of this low came dance. We had this constant open eighth note on the hi-hat, and uh was it rigid bass kicks on 1 and 3, snare on 2 and 4. And then eventually we added more instruments, added an chordal element to this, and the drums kind of shifted off those constant open hi-hat into something that hit the cymbals on the offbeats, which is still such a dancey idea. And the whole section kind of feels celebratory in a way. This was getting closer to the end though, and I'm not sure if that was supposed to signify a victory and taking an anachronistic view at dance music, or what that was supposed to represent, but it feels so out of place against everything else. And then eventually they put the black metal 16th note picking on top of it, and that was just the icing on the cake for this anachronistic concept. Very interesting. But overall, I kind of get a picture of a setting, something very woodsy or plain, an open field, and then a battle, and then noise, and then quiet, and then dancing, and then the song fades out. Is that I can't remember what happened at the end though. It certainly paints some sort of picture of a battle, but the details are a bit hazy given some of the eclectic choices of timbre combinations and composition combinations going on in the track. I'm going to hit some lyrics, see what's going on here, and we will wrap this up. So, at least on a first glance, this track seems to be about an everlasting bloodthirstiness. It's called Echoes of Battle, and it's not necessarily about a specific battle, but it is simultaneously about a specific battle. And I'm not sure if this battle is uh, a real one that they're referencing or just the concept of battle. But the opening stanza is repeated at the end. It's the only repeated stanza, and it pretty much sets the groundwork for the themes here. There's a deep pathos here, a monumental sorrow. Blood has stained the ground, the very land in itself a barrow. So it speaks about how a war has been waged here, and through that blood is in the ground, and sorrow is in the air. It then goes to speak about the battle as if through a memory of recounting it, about swords being held high and victory and loss. And people are left bereaved. There's a marching drum that, or sorry, a battle drum that marches on. There's triumph, there's defeat. And it says, after all of this, so many warriors have fallen. It never quite says who was right and who was wrong. It just says, a host of warriors fallen. Everyone was a warrior here. Then empires were built upon the bones of those who stood beside us. The sun has set eternally into the dark, and we have seen the fields of war steal the lives of sons and brothers. So it begins to speak how the world moves on. This was a battlefield at one time, and it no longer is. But things are not bright. There was a victory for someone, but the sun has still set into darkness. Goes on to say that the iron heart of glory beats a hollow dirge. The gods of battle rise and fall, but the thirst for blood lives on. The sands forever greedily consume the blood of friends and fathers. So it's not gods that call for war. There are gods of war. They rise, they fall, and yet we still have a bloodthirst. Wars will continue to be waged on. Goes to say that the sands will greedily consume the blood, but it also alludes to the fact that the rulers who might have built their empire here, and here could be anywhere that a battlefield once was, are ready to wage another war despite standing on the history of a monumental area, one that still has sorrow hanging in the air. It should be felt the negatives of war and how they might outweigh the positives, and yet the people who decide to build these empires refuse to heed those warnings, despite being on a place that still has the blood of innocence in the ground. After this, we end where we began. The deep pathos resides here, a monumental sorrow. Blood has stained the ground, and the very land itself a barrow. Yeah, I mean, this is powerful lyrics, powerful theme, talking about how it's not anything else, it's just humans. We're kind of garbage sometimes, and it's usually the ones that are most in power who make the worst decisions. And it's interesting to pair that then with the folky music. I think they do a good job. Actually, that explains why we have the clashing of the steel and the people yelling only at the beginning, because those were the two stanzas when we envisioned the battle itself. Everything before that and after that was the present. And the parts where he says that an empire is built here on top of the bones of those who were struck down in his fields, all that stuff. That was all the black metal section. That's the aggressive element. There's almost an anger there at the people who don't learn from history, who don't heed the words of warning against starting another war, despite where they themselves live, what the ground signifies beneath their feet. It still feels just a tad bit eclectically thrown together. Most of the transitions are nice. The dance part still I have no idea how that fits into this. That dance drum pattern is gonna get me every time. Um, but I do think this is a very ambitious track, compositionally, lyrically, pairing it all together thematically, and it hits more often than it misses. And for something as big as this, which is going to be difficult to achieve regardless, I think having a higher hit rate than your miss rate is a success, at least in my books. So those are my thoughts on Caladan Brood's Echoes of Battle. What'd you think, though? Did you enjoy it? Was there anything that stood out to you that maybe I didn't cover or didn't cover enough? Maybe there's something I said that you want to correct me on, or maybe you just have your own thoughts on the track that you'd like to supply. Put that stuff down in the comments. Above the comment section is a description box. In there you'll find a link to Linktree. It takes you to this menu right here. You can find my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Greatly appreciate all three. Alright, we have a special selection coming up next. Otherwise, see you guys tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 p.m. UTC, as usual. We'll continue on with this week's theme of one-album bands and look at another special selection. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you choose to watch my videos.